Hey everybody. I wanted to make a short video just to follow up on some things that we talked about in class on Wednesday. Just because with the way the time worked out and the way the kind of discussion took shape and everything, it didn't quite get to finish up some of the points I wanted to make as we were talking about, particularly regarding the Second Amendment. And I wanted to, again, just do that real quickly and not take too much time. But if you remember, we talked about my point in that lecture was really to think about how we need to be careful in thinking historically about the Constitution generally and the conditions under which it's written and the reasons that parts of it are written. And we also certainly need to do that with regards to the Second Amendment. And I said we have kind of three different mistakes that often get made, regardless of the end of the political spectrum, with regards to the Second Amendment. The first is that we apply a very individualistic kind of lens to it, right? That we think of this as an individual right. The second is that we kind of fail to contextualize it in the historical moment, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And the third is that we think of it as sort of an absolute right, right? That we interpret that shall not be infringed to mean, shall not be regulated. There shall be no laws on the books. And so often the argument is made, this is kind of the way that America was in the beginning, in this kind of original context, and this is what the founders intended. And so I want to just kind of look at that a little bit more with regards to the Second Amendment and kind of the reasons it's in there in the first place, right? So we can kind of see some of the reasoning for why the Second Amendment exists in the actual phrasing of the amendment. That the first part of the amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, right? And so the question that we ask ourselves is why? Why is a well-regulated militia necessary to the security of a free state, right? This is not something that we talk about today, right? And this goes, the point I made in class briefly before is that the founding generation saw one of the most pernicious and dangerous threats to liberty in this idea of standing armies. That is, that the ruler of a country that had access to a standing army, a group of professional lifetime soldiers, that they could essentially use that force to hijack the government, to become a tyrant, right? And they certainly looked to ancient history and precedents like Rome and Caesar becoming an emperor, as part of that. And they also looked at their exact context. And you can see some of that in this engraving, View of the Port of Boston by Paul Revere, which at first glance sort of just looks like this kind of this port and cityscape with ships around. But this is a piece of propaganda by Paul Revere to illustrate the part that we often miss if we just kind of glance at this print, which is the actual port here, the actual dock rather, and the standing armies, the British Army coming in to occupy Boston. Right, this is meant to be really an alarming photograph. It's meant to, or not photograph, but engraving. It's meant to look at all of these British ships that have now blockaded the port of Boston, and coming in off these on these boats off the ships. It's just this wave after wave, this invasion of British troops occupying the city, right? And so then this is one of the drivers, as we talked about, that leads to the revolution, right? The occupation of Boston after 1768, which then leads eventually to the Boston Massacre and these abuses of power. So the framers of the Constitution, the revolutionary generation, they were very fearful of a standing army as being a way that a tyrant would take control. And so they saw militias, these kind of citizen groups that could be called upon when needed to be the antidote to this, to be the way that you don't have a professional standing army that can be directed by a tyrant, but you will have citizens who will give up and they will serve, they will come to the call of their country or their state when needed, right? Whether that's insurrections within the country, or it's an attack by a foreign enemy, whatever it might be, right? And so, in this phrase, a well-regulated militia, meaning one that is lawful, right? One that is called upon by the state, and one that is also limited in its length of service, right? That it is confined, it is controlled, right? And so the Second Amendment is not actually really about guns. It's actually about preventing standing armies. The framers of the Constitution didn't have anything against individual gun ownership, but it was simply not an issue that really concerned the founding generation. There's not an amendment that guarantees your right to own wagons or horses or whatever, right? Because these things are assumed. Yes, it was assumed that people would be allowed to own firearms, but the reason that gun that uh, the right to bear arms is specified in the Constitution is about the first part of the amendment, right? It's about trying to prevent standing armies by having a citizen soldier group that could be called on. And as I talked about, many states had mandatory militia service, right? And the other part, so I think that's an important context. And then the other part is that the Second Amendment often gets interpreted as the kind of protection against government, right? That it's a protection of people's freedom. So the idea being that if government got tyrannical or something like that, well, the reason that the Second Amendment is there and gives people the right to bear arms is that then they can rise up and resist the government, right? And that's not really, it's not the way that it's discussed at all in terms of the Constitutional Convention. And in fact, in a lot of ways, you can argue the Constitutional Convention is called because of events like Shays' Rebellion, in which people rose up with their weapons and threatened to overthrow the government of Massachusetts, right? Used violence against the government. And the framers of the Constitution saw this as dangerous. They saw that they didn't say like, yeah, you're using your arms to resist government. That's good. That's why we're going to eventually draft a Second Amendment. No, they actually saw this as a sign that the government was weak, right? And similarly, the Whiskey Rebellion, which happens in Western Pennsylvania, right? Really more closer to Pittsburgh and south of Pittsburgh, in which these kind of backcountry Pennsylvanians rise up against the tax collectors who are trying to tax whiskey, right? This is not seen as a positive or as something that we want to make sure is protected. This is seen as a threat, and in fact is sort of written into law and protected specifically by Congress passing the Militia Act of 1792. That author, it says, whenever the laws of the United States shall be opposed or the execution thereof obstructed in any state, it shall be lawful for the President of the United States to call forth the militia and suppress those combinations. And then it also specifies whenever it's necessary to use military force, as it's authorized here, the president will command such insurgents to disperse and retire peaceably to their respective abodes within a limited time, right? So again, it's a well-regulated militia, right? So again, it really, the intent behind the Second Amendment doesn't really have anything to do with protecting individuals' rights to own guns specifically, right? It really is about having a militia so we don't have a standing army, right? Now, obviously, we have a permanent military today, and that's a much longer history, but about how that comes about. But Washington actually leads this militia out he goes as far as Maryland, organizing this militia and raising them up and commanding them to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion. And so for the sort of leaders of the early national period, this is exactly the way the militia is supposed to work, right? So, and then finally, I think the other, going back to that idea of absolutism, we often assume that right of shall not be infringed means that people intended that there never be any laws regulating guns. And this is really just not accurate. There are plenty of gun of laws on the books regulating when and where and how and what kinds of weapons people could own, and how they could be used, right? So, for example, in Pennsylvania in 1776, if people refused to take a loyalty oath that said they were supportive of the revolution, supportive of the new state of Pennsylvania, they had to give up their arms. In Massachusetts, 1798, no person shall ride or go armed offensively, to the fear or terror of the good citizens of this Commonwealth. It was essentially a law saying you couldn't just carry weapons around with you all the time, right? Virginia, 1792, a very similar kind of law on the books. And then here's one in Alabama, 1839, that said basically fined people for as much as up to $500 for carrying a concealed weapon, carrying a concealed firearm, right? So again, lots of regulations at the state level. Some more, regulations about where you could fire weapons, right? You couldn't do this in a town. Another one from North Carolina that taxed every pistol owned by people, taxed them at $1.25, which of course means also that the government had to know you owned firearms. So these were required to be reported to government authorities, right? Again, regulations, tracking ownership, taxing firearms. And then Kansas, 1898, actually, it's a bit later here, but the state actually passes laws that enable town and city councils to prohibit and punish the carrying of firearms or other deadly weapons within their borders, right? So there's lots of ways in which early Americans, yes, absolutely believed that people had a right to own guns as much as, and I will say also, there are laws that restrict this by race, that, Native Americans and increasingly as we move forward through the 19th century, Black people or slaves are not allowed to own guns. But it was assumed, yes, of course you have a right to own property, but it's not about anything special about guns. It's not anything that's the idea that something special about guns will protect freedoms, right? It's really this belief that we need to prevent a standing army. We need to prevent there being sufficient military power for someone to seize that military and become a tyrant. So anyway, that's what I wanted to kind of make sure that I fully elaborated on. Again, if folks would like to talk about this, I'd love to. And by the way, I've got just a couple of sources that I've drawn some of this from. Duke University's law school has a Center for Firearms Law. They have a whole repository of historical gun laws on the books throughout American history, and an article that I would definitely recommend from the Fordham Law Review, which might be a good resource that kind of goes over some of these, the context for the Second Amendment. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and let me know if you have questions. Thanks.